Chosen one, stop for a moment, and I mean really stop. Let the other videos wait, let the other voices grow quiet, because something in you already knows why this message found you at this particular moment. You are late, and somewhere beneath all the explanations you have given yourself, you have known that for years, which may be why 2 in the morning sometimes find you staring into the dark, quietly calculating where you thought your life would be by now. I am not saying that to shame you. I am saying it because you deserve enough honesty to finally look at this without turning away, and the truth has 2 sides. The first side may hurt, but the second can change the way you remember every year you thought was simply gone. The windows you missed did not disappear as though they had never existed. What belonged inside them was carried forward, held somewhere you could not yet see. Tonight I want you to understand why some part of you seemed unable to reach for what you wanted, why your hand could come close to the handle and still stop, and why the story you have been calling too late may be missing something important. So stay with this, because walking away before you hear the whole thing may leave you standing inside the same old conclusion. Before we go further, press the like button as a simple act of agreement, not for numbers, but as a quiet way of saying that you are willing to hear something difficult without immediately running from it. And then settle in, because we are going directly toward one of the most painful sentences you have carried for years. I should be further along by now. You have probably said it without those exact words while looking at an old photograph and wondering what happened to the hope in that younger face, or hearing about someone you once knew moving into a life you imagined for yourself. You can genuinely celebrate another person and still feel something ache inside you when you put the phone down. Lately, comparison may have started feeling sharper than it used to. Every scroll can place another person's finished chapter beside the unfinished pages of your own, showing you the trip you postponed, the idea you wrote down and left inside a drawer, or the confident version of yourself you once believed you would become. You call it inspiration when other people are listening, but sometimes, in the quiet of your own room, it feels much closer to grief, because you are not only grieving what you failed to accomplish, you are grieving the person you once believed you would already be. And beneath all of that, there may be another feeling you have struggled to name. It is a quiet urgency, almost like a low sound beneath the day, something that follows you into ordinary moments, even when there is no deadline on your calendar that explains it. You can be washing dishes, driving home, lying in bed, and suddenly feel that strange inner pressure again, as though something inside you is asking you to pay attention. Chosen one, do not dismiss that feeling simply because you cannot yet explain it. Sometimes recognition arrives in the body before the mind has language for what it is sensing. Think about those late-night calculations again, the ones where you subtract your age from some imaginary deadline and watch the number make your chest tighten. Keep that memory close, because there is an assumption hidden inside that arithmetic, and once you see it, you may never calculate your life in quite the same way again. But first you have to be honest about what actually happened, because you cannot understand restoration while refusing to look at what was lost. You have watched real opportunities pass within reach, an idea you had before someone else built something similar, a move you researched but never made, a conversation you rehearsed in your mind so many times that the words almost became real. You saw some of those doors clearly, and still you stayed where you were. Maybe you remember the exact feeling, your mind suddenly filling with reasons, your energy disappearing, your attention finding something meaningless to occupy itself with, and then, somehow, the moment passing before you had even decided to let it pass. What looked like laziness from the outside often carried something much more complicated inside. A person can want something desperately and still freeze when wanting it means risking disappointment, responsibility, exposure, or the possibility that the dream might become real. That is why I want you to look closely at the space between seeing and doing. The opportunity appears, and for a moment you can almost see yourself on the other side of it. You can feel what it might be like. Picture the life, sense the relief, and then something changes. A fog settles in. Tiredness arrives out of nowhere. Another task suddenly feels urgent, and before you understand what happened, the moment has moved beyond you. Then comes that particular kind of grief that is difficult to explain because you are mourning something you never actually got to live. That gap deserves your attention. Not only the dramatic failures, but the countless tiny hesitations no one saw. The moments when you almost moved, and then quietly surrendered another inch of your future. No one gathered around those moments to acknowledge them. And perhaps you never allowed yourself to either. Who holds a funeral for a decision that was never made, for a beginning that never began, for a version of you that existed only for a few seconds before fear talked you out of becoming them? Heaven saw those moments. And more importantly, the story did not become meaningless simply because you hesitated inside it. So ask yourself gently, what has been keeping you from reaching for the handle when you could see the door, feel the desire, and know exactly what you wanted? You may have spent years calling that weakness, when underneath it was a pattern that learned how to protect you by keeping you still. The desire remained because some part of you never stopped knowing that there was more to your life than the place where you had become comfortable waiting. Now look at the cost, but do it without turning the exercise into punishment. Think about the relationships that grew distant while you were somewhere else inside yourself, the money attached to ideas you never acted upon, the energy consumed by worrying about things you were also postponing, and even the prayers you stopped bringing to heaven because asking for the same thing again began to feel embarrassing. Let yourself acknowledge those losses without making them your identity. This is an accounting, yes, but it is an accounting meant to bring clarity, not condemnation. If you have ever grieved a version of yourself you never got to meet, type 111 in the comments right now. Let it be a timestamp, a quiet marker for the moment you stopped treating that grief as a private failure and finally allowed yourself to name it. And when you see other people placing the same number beneath this message, remember that your experience has never been as isolated as it felt in the dark. So many people have mistaken their delayed lives for proof that they were personally disqualified, carrying the same silent question without realizing how many others were carrying it too. But here is where the story begins to change. Heaven saw every window you missed, and heaven does not keep the same kind of record that regret keeps. Regret looks at a missed opportunity and writes it down as something erased, something that can never be recovered. Heaven can hold the same moment differently as something that was delayed, carried forward, and preserved until you were able to meet it with a different version of yourself. What was meant for you did not become meaningless simply because you were not ready to receive it at the first moment you saw it. Let that reach the part of you that has been grieving quietly. The losses were real, the years were real, and the opportunities mattered, but the story was never reduced to an empty room. You may have spent years standing outside, convinced there was nothing left inside for you, while something you thought had vanished was still being held beyond the door, and that belief, that quiet conviction that your time had simply passed, that it was too late for you, that everyone else had moved ahead while your life remained behind, may have been the very lie that kept you from reaching for the handle. And if, somewhere in the next minute, you suddenly feel the urge to leave this video, notice it. Pay attention to the part of you that starts reaching for something lighter, something easier, something that asks nothing from your heart. Chosen one, that impulse may feel ordinary, but tonight it deserves your attention, because sometimes the moment we begin getting close to something painful is the exact moment we feel the strongest need to escape it. You are late, and I am still going to tell you the truth about that, but you are late in the way. A person could be late after spending years walking in circles, because they were following directions that were never truly theirs. The delay is real, but the story you built around it may be carrying far more blame than it deserves. Somewhere along the way you learned to call yourself the problem, and that belief became so familiar that you stopped questioning where it came from. Stay with me, because we are going to name the things that have kept you circling, and once you can finally see them, you can begin meeting them differently. For years, you have probably blamed your discipline, your personality, your lack of consistency, or some flaw you believed other people simply did not have. You made plans, promised yourself you would begin again, set alarms, bought notebooks, created new routines, and then watched the same pattern return when the moment finally came to act. The painful part is that you usually knew what you wanted. You could see the possibility clearly, and still something inside you would become tired, distracted, uncertain, or suddenly convinced that tomorrow would be better. So let yourself look at these layers honestly, without turning the examination into another reason to punish yourself. The first layer is the scroll. There are moments when you reach for your phone because you intend to do one small thing, and somehow you surface much later with the strange feeling that you have been somewhere without actually going anywhere. You may remember that moment when you finally look up and realize the room has grown quiet around you, while the thing you cared about is still waiting exactly where you left it. Chosen one, the important question is not simply how much time disappeared. It is what feeling that distraction allowed you to postpone, because sometimes you scroll when you're tired, but sometimes you scroll because becoming still would bring you face to face with a decision you have been carrying. Sometimes constant stimulation gives you somewhere to place the restlessness that rises when you remember the life you once imagined for yourself. There is no need to turn that realization into shame. Simply notice what happens inside you when the noise stops and your unfinished life becomes audible again. That awareness matters because you cannot change a pattern while remaining completely unaware of what the pattern has been protecting you from feeling. The second layer is entertainment that slowly becomes escape. Real rest leaves something in you restored, but there is another kind of escape that gives you hours of comfort while quietly leaving you more distant from yourself afterward. You watch another episode, another clip, another story, and for a little while you get to live somewhere other than inside the questions waiting for you. Then the screen goes dark, the room becomes quiet again, and the same unfinished feeling returns. Think about how much of your life has been spent simply trying to feel less of what you were carrying. You do not have to calculate every lost hour or punish yourself for the years that passed. Let the realization land gently. Somewhere inside those hours were dreams you still remember, ideas you once cared about, and parts of yourself that kept asking to be given another chance. The fact that you can still feel them means something in you remained awake beneath the numbness. The third layer is counterfeit busyness. This one can be especially difficult to recognize because it often looks responsible from the outside. Errands, obligations, favors, messages, appointments, tasks that multiply until every open space in your day disappears. You can spend an entire day moving and still arrive at night with the quiet knowledge that you never touched the one thing that mattered most to you. Being occupied can feel productive while protecting you from the vulnerability of actually choosing what deserves your attention. You may have become very good at filling the room so completely that you never have to hear the question underneath it all. What am I really trying to avoid? The enemy does not need you completely still. Sometimes constant movement serves the same purpose because exhaustion leaves very little strength for the life you keep saying you will begin. Chosen one, notice the difference between being busy and being moved by something that genuinely belongs to you. One can consume your energy, while the other gives that energy somewhere meaningful to go. And then there is the fourth layer, the one that follows you into silence, the inner prosecutor. This is the voice that appears after the phone is down, after the entertainment ends, after the busy day finally becomes still. It reviews your age, your missed chances, your mistakes, and every year you believe you should have used differently. Then quietly delivers the same sentence: you waited too long, you should have done it years ago, and people like you do not get another chance. This voice is powerful because it rarely sounds like an enemy. It sounds like you. It uses your memories, your disappointments, your own vocabulary, and every moment you regret, arranging them carefully until the verdict feels like common sense. That is why you may have carried it for so long without realizing that a wound can speak in your own voice and still be a wound. So tonight, chosen one, question the sentence. When did you first decide that it was too late for you? Go back gently, not to accuse yourself, but to remember what happened around the moment that belief took root. Perhaps it began after a rejection, a loss, a missed opportunity, a relationship that changed you, or a season when you were simply too exhausted to keep believing. Pain may have spoken the sentence first, habit may have repeated it afterward, and eventually you may have mistaken repetition for truth. But a sentence can live in you for years without deserving the authority you gave it. Count the layers honestly, chosen one, and notice which ones have been keeping you asleep. Most people discover more than one, and sometimes the deepest shift begins when you finally recognize that the voice telling you your story is over has been speaking from an old wound all along. And now, chosen one, hear the sentence that begins your release from this old pattern. Every layer had a purpose, and your attention did not simply disappear by accident. Something found the places where you were most vulnerable and kept drawing you away from the very things you cared about. And for a while, it worked. The sedation was never proof that you were weaker than everyone else. It found a part of you that was tired, wounded, afraid, or simply unaware of how deeply you had learned to escape, and recognizing that changes the way you look at all those years. If you just recognized yourself in those layers, type awake in the comments. Let the word mean something personal to you, a quiet decision that you are willing to notice what has been shaping your attention instead of moving through it unconsciously. There is something powerful about naming what you have finally seen, especially after carrying it silently for so long. And now that we have named the pattern, we can begin to look at the clock you have been using to judge your entire life. Because there is another belief underneath your midnight calculations that has been hurting you for years. You have been measuring yourself against a calendar that was never designed to measure your calling. By a certain age, you were supposed to have the career, the relationship, the money, the home, the certainty, the life everyone around you seemed to be building on schedule. Miss one marker, then another, and eventually you begin to feel as though the world has stamped the word late across your name. But Scripture carries another understanding of time, and that distinction may be one of the reasons your panic and your purpose have felt like they were speaking two completely different languages. The ancient language speaks of time in more than one way. Chronos is the time you can count, the hours moving across the clock, the birthdays arriving one after another, the years that seem to pass with the same steady rhythm for everyone. Kairos speaks of something more intimate, an appointed moment, a particular opening, a time when something is ready to happen in a way that cannot be measured simply by age. Chronos asks, how long has it been? Kairos asks something deeper, are you present when the moment arrives? And chosen one, imagine what happens when you stop using the world's ruler to measure a life that was never meant to unfold according to everyone else's schedule. The person who seems ahead of you may simply be walking a different road, with different doors, different seasons, and different moments that require their presence. You have spent years comparing your life to timelines that were never yours, then wondering why your own life kept looking like a failure when measured against them. Perhaps the ruler was wrong long before you ever decided you were. You were not necessarily broken. You may have been out of rhythm with yourself. And there is hope in realizing that because rhythm can return, a watch that is running but showing the wrong hour does not need to become a different watch. Sometimes it simply needs to be reset. The desire inside you is still there, or you would not feel that ache when you hear about the life you once imagined. And the part of you that still recognizes what matters is still alive. What drifted was the connection between what you could see and what you felt able to do. But I know the question rising in you now, and you deserve an honest answer. If there were appointed moments in your past, did you miss them? Did some doors open while you were too afraid, too exhausted, too distracted, or too wounded to walk through them? Yes, chosen one. Some moments were missed, and I will not erase that pain with a beautiful sentence, because pretending the losses never mattered would only make your grief feel more invisible. And yet this is where the mercy of divine timing becomes different from the world's understanding of time. The world tends to treat a missed opportunity as something permanently gone, a door that closed and a record that cannot be changed, while faith leaves room for what can still be restored, revisited, transformed, or carried forward in another form. What you missed does not have to become meaningless simply because you could not receive it when it first appeared. Sometimes what remains unfinished continues to shape you quietly until you are able to meet it with a different heart. Hold on to that idea for a moment, because this is where your understanding of delay begins to change. You have been taught to imagine waiting as something that makes a dream weaker. something that slowly drains its color until there is nothing left to hope for. But some things become deeper while they wait. Some experiences gather meaning, perspective, maturity, and weight in the hidden years. And if you have spent your life believing that arriving late means arriving empty-handed, then stay with me. Because Scripture tells stories of people who discovered that the last chapter could carry more than they ever imagined when they thought their time had already passed. There is a pattern in Scripture that becomes difficult to ignore once you begin noticing it. Some of heaven's most unforgettable moments happen when the people involved have almost every reason to believe their moment has already passed. Rescue arrives when the clock seems cruelest, when the night is almost over, when human calculation says there is no time left. And that matters for you, chosen one, because the place you have been calling too late may be the very place where this pattern begins to feel personal. Open the record and look closely at the people whose stories were preserved. Abraham received a promise when age had already made the promise seem almost impossible. And then years passed before the answer came. Moses was 80, living as a fugitive with decades of silence behind him, when the burning bush interrupted the life he thought had become permanent. David was anointed while he was still young, then spent years hiding in caves while another man occupied the throne. Their stories were never built around perfect timing by human standards. They were built around moments that arrived when the people involved had already learned what waiting felt like. And then there is Peter, and I want you to hear this one differently. He was locked inside a heavily guarded prison, chained between soldiers, knowing that morning could bring his death, while others were praying for him outside. Then, in the middle of that final night, heaven moved. An angel appeared, the chains came loose, and the door opened when there seemed to be almost no time left. But notice what Peter was doing when the answer arrived. He was sleeping. He was not pacing the cell, rehearsing every possible escape, or trying to force heaven's hand. He was so deeply asleep that the angel had to strike him to wake him. There is something deeply human in that detail, because it means the miracle did not require Peter to maintain perfect emotional strength throughout the waiting. When the light came, he simply had to wake up, listen, and take the next step. Remember that distinction. Chosen one, heaven handled what Peter could never have handled from inside that cell. But Peter still had to get up when the moment came and follow the opening in front of him. You may have spent years believing that your delay disqualified you because you were not ready enough, faithful enough, disciplined enough, or certain enough. But perhaps the deeper invitation is much simpler when the door opens again. Will you recognize it, and will you be willing to move? That is what these stories keep revealing. The last hour does not always mean the end. Sometimes it is where the answer becomes impossible to explain away as ordinary timing. An early opening can be dismissed as coincidence, preparation, or good fortune. But when something shifts at the moment you had already stopped expecting it, the meaning lands differently. Your lateness, chosen one, does not have to erase you from the story. And before we go further, if someone you love has quietly stopped believing in their own future, share this message with them. You probably know the person, the one who used to speak about a dream in the present tense and now talks about it like it belonged to another life, the one who has become unusually quiet, the one who says they are fine while something inside them has gone still. Sometimes a message reaches a person at the exact moment they have stopped asking for one. And if the voice inside you is already objecting, saying, those were biblical people, their stories were different, listen to that objection for a moment. Then ask yourself why you believe your humanity makes you less worthy of hope, less capable of change, or somehow excluded from the possibility that a life can turn in a moment you never expected. The same human emotions appear throughout these stories: fear, waiting, confusion, exhaustion, doubt, and the painful feeling that time has already moved too far ahead. Now we can return to the question we have been carrying from the beginning. Why did you see so many possibilities and still struggle to move toward them? Why could you feel something so clearly inside yourself, imagine the life so vividly, and then find yourself hesitating when it was time to take the first step? This is where the idea of synchronization becomes important, because sometimes the distance between seeing and doing is created long before the moment of decision arrives. Think about how stress changes the way you move through your days. When you have spent years carrying pressure, criticism, disappointment, constant stimulation, or the fear of getting something wrong, your mind can become accustomed to hesitation. An idea appears, and for a moment you can see it beautifully. Then another part of you begins asking whether you have enough information, whether the timing is right, whether you are capable, whether you should wait a little longer. The vision is still there, but somewhere between recognizing it and acting on it, the signal becomes crowded. That may explain something you have struggled to forgive yourself for. You were not always lacking desire. Sometimes you wanted the thing so deeply that moving toward it carried its own vulnerability. Taking action would have made the dream real enough to succeed or fail, and staying in thought allowed you to protect the possibility a little longer. So the fog that appeared in those moments, the sudden tiredness, the need to check something unimportant, the impulse to postpone the decision again, may have been part of a pattern you learned over time rather than evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with you. And when you begin bringing those parts of yourself back into alignment, the experience can feel different. Your vision can meet your willingness, your intention can meet your next step, and the distance between knowing and doing can gradually become smaller. You do not have to become a completely different person overnight. You simply have to begin noticing the moments when something inside you is trying to move again. So pay attention now, chosen one, because there are signs that this bridge between seeing and doing may already be beginning to reopen in your life. They may be subtle at first, a thought that keeps returning, an unfinished desire that refuses to disappear, a sudden clarity about something you have postponed for years. There are 5 signs I want you to recognize, because you may already be experiencing them without realizing what they mean. And if you feel the urge to leave this video sometime in the next minute, notice it. You do not have to fight yourself or judge yourself for it. Simply notice how quickly your attention reaches for something lighter when a difficult truth gets close. There is a reason distraction can feel almost comforting at the exact moment you begin to wake up. Tonight, that pull matters, because some part of you may already recognize that the story you have been telling yourself about being too late is beginning to crack. You are late, chosen one. I still mean that, and I am not going to dress it up in softer language just to make you comfortable. But there is a difference between being late and being responsible for every year that passed. Like a traveler who has been circling the same roads because the directions were never clear in the first place. The delay was real, the missed opportunities were real, and the pain attached to them is real. But the blame you have carried for all of it may never have belonged entirely to you. And there is something you need to understand before we go any further. For years you may have blamed your discipline, your personality, your lack of consistency, or some flaw you believed everyone else had somehow outgrown. So you tried planners, promises, alarms, fresh starts, and private vows that lasted until the old pattern returned. Yet underneath all of that was something much more tender. You were trying to move while carrying a belief that had already convinced you. The door was probably closed. You cannot release a sentence you have never learned to recognize. So let us name what has been happening. The first layer is distraction. The endless reaching for your phone when you already know what you meant to do, the little escape that becomes an hour before you realize where the time went. The second is entertainment that feels like rest but leaves you strangely emptier afterward, because real rest gives something back, while constant stimulation simply keeps you from sitting quietly with what your heart has been asking you to face. The third is busyness, the kind that fills every corner of your calendar and leaves you exhausted enough to believe you must have been productive, even when the thing that mattered most remained untouched. And then there is the fourth layer, chosen one, the one that follows you into the quiet. It is the voice that appears when the room is dark, and the phone is finally face down, the voice that reminds you of your age. The opportunity you missed, the person who moved ahead, the dream you abandoned, and then quietly concludes, "Too late for me." It sounds like you, because it has been speaking in your vocabulary for so long. using your memories as evidence and your disappointments as proof. That is why you trusted it. But tonight, question that voice. Take the sentence, "Too late for me," and trace it backward through your life. Remember the first wound that made you feel behind, the first comparison that made you question your timing, the first moment when disappointment began sounding like destiny. You may discover that the sentence was born from pain, repeated through habit, and eventually mistaken for truth. Count how many of those layers you recognize, chosen one, and hold that number quietly for yourself. Now hear what begins to change when you can finally see the pattern. Your attention did not simply disappear because you were weak, and your desire did not vanish because you lacked character. Something in you kept reaching toward the life you could still imagine, which is why certain ideas returned. Certain dreams kept resurfacing, and certain quiet hours still carried that strange feeling that there was something you had not finished. The sedation worked because it touched a vulnerability you had not yet learned how to protect. Type awake in the comments if you recognized yourself in what we just named. Let that word be simple. You do not have to make it dramatic. Sometimes the first act of waking up is simply admitting, "Yes, that is me," and allowing yourself to stop hiding from what you already know. Now we need to talk about time, because the second belief underneath your panic is that your life has been measured by the calendar everyone else handed you. You look at your age, the milestones you thought would have happened by now, the career you imagined, the relationship you expected, the version of yourself you thought you would already be, and you use those things as evidence that you are behind. But spiritual timing has never been as simple as a number on a calendar. Scripture gives us a different way of thinking about time. There is the ordinary passing of hours, the steady movement that places one birthday after another, and there are moments that carry a different kind of weight. Moments when something arrives because the conditions for it have finally come together. One measures how long you have lived. The other asks whether you were ready to recognize what was in front of you. And when you have spent years measuring your life by someone else's clock, it is easy to mistake a different rhythm for a failed one. Think about what that does to comparison. The person who passed you on the timeline may never have been running the same race. Their opportunities are not your opportunities, their seasons are not your seasons, and their visible harvest tells you very little about what has been happening beneath the surface of your own life. You have been holding a ruler against yourself that was never designed to measure what you were becoming. That is why I want you to consider a different word: unsynchronized. Something can still be alive, still have movement, still contain desire and possibility, while the pieces remain out of rhythm with one another. Your desire is still here, or you would not be listening. That quiet pull is still here, or you would not keep returning to the same unfinished questions. What has been disrupted is the connection between seeing and doing, and unlike the years already behind you, that connection can begin changing in the present. But perhaps you are asking the question that hurts most. If there were moments you were supposed to recognize, did you miss them? Yes, chosen one. There were doors you walked past. There were conversations you postponed, decisions you kept reconsidering, opportunities you watched move beyond reach. And I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. Some things were genuinely missed, and grieving that reality is part of becoming honest with your own story. But missed does not always mean meaningless. What you did not do still shaped you. What you learned still lives inside you, and what remained unfinished can carry a different kind of weight when you finally become willing to face it. This is where the mercy of divine timing begins to look different from the world's idea of a deadline. The world often treats delay as disappearance. Faith leaves room for restoration, for return, for something that was once dormant to become meaningful again. That is why the stories of Scripture carry so much weight. Again and again, the most dramatic turns come at moments when the people involved had every reason to believe the window had already closed. A man was rescued on the night before his execution, not comfortably in advance, but at the final possible hour. Abraham waited long enough for the promise to seem almost impossible. Moses was 80, carrying decades of exile and a life he probably assumed belonged to the past, when the burning bush interrupted his ordinary day. David was anointed young, and then spent years in caves before the promise surrounding his life became visible. And remember Peter. He was sitting in a prison cell, chained between soldiers, with death scheduled for the morning. Then, in the night, help arrived. What strikes me is not only that the rescue came at the last moment, but that Peter was sleeping. He was not performing perfect faith. He was not pacing the room trying to force heaven's hand. When the light came, he simply had to wake up and follow it. There is something deeply comforting in that, chosen one. You do not have to pretend the waiting never hurt you, and you do not have to manufacture some perfect emotional state before you can move again. There comes a moment when the responsibility becomes much simpler. Recognize what is in front of you and take the next step. The larger movement may be beyond your control, but the immediate response still belongs to you. So when the voice in you says, "Those were Bible characters, not me," listen closely. That may be the old prosecutor returning with another objection. You are still a human being, living inside the same kind of uncertainty, longing, delay, fear, and hope that fills those stories, and their value is not that you are promised the exact same outcome. Their value is that lateness has never been the final word in the spiritual imagination. And now we can return to the pattern that has followed you for years. You saw something clearly, felt the possibility of it, and then somewhere between the vision and the action, the energy disappeared. Suddenly there was another task, another reason to wait, another piece of information you needed, another day that seemed more suitable. Then the moment passed, and you were left grieving something that had never even become real enough for anyone else to understand why it hurt. That gap matters, chosen one, not because it proves something is wrong with you, but because it is where your story has repeatedly changed direction. Thousands of tiny hesitations can become a life when they are repeated quietly enough, and no one sees the weight of them, because each individual moment looks too small to mourn. Yet you have felt that weight. You have carried the memory of things you almost began, almost said, almost became. Now let yourself imagine that every one of those moments was seen, not as a record designed to condemn you, but as part of a story you have been unable to read clearly from inside it. You have been counting the missed years as deletions, while another way of seeing your life asks what those years deposited in you: discernment, endurance, clarity, tenderness, and a deeper understanding of what you are actually unwilling to keep postponing. That is the accounting error in your late-night arithmetic. You have been subtracting every year that did not become what you hoped, while forgetting everything those years taught you to carry. You counted toward the moment when you would finally have to admit it was too late. Meanwhile, something inside you kept accumulating the strength to question that conclusion. Both calculations were based on the same life, but they were measuring different things. This is where the promise of restoration becomes personal. I will restore to you the years the locust has eaten. Sit with the word restore for a moment. Restoration does not always mean receiving the exact past you imagined. Sometimes it means seeing meaning return to years you thought were wasted, feeling life move through places that had gone quiet, and discovering that what you thought was permanently lost still has something to teach, shape, or awaken in you. And restoration asks for participation, not perfection, not worthiness, not a complete healing of every wound before you begin. It asks you to show up. The account you have been grieving cannot become part of your present life while you remain convinced that your past has already decided what you are allowed to become. So what has been standing between you and that possibility all these years? Maybe it was never God. Your continued desire tells you that. Maybe it was never a lack of longing, because you know how often that unfinished dream has followed you into the quietest hours. Somewhere along the way, you signed an agreement with a sentence you barely noticed. It is too late for me. You did not announce it publicly. You repeated it privately in the dark. After another birthday, another rejection, another person passed you, another year disappeared. Eventually it stopped feeling like a thought and became the lens through which you interpreted everything. Tonight, chosen one, you're allowed to question that agreement. Say this slowly with me if it carries meaning for you. I release the belief that my life has already passed me by. I release the conclusion that my missed years define what remains. I'm willing to meet what is still alive in me, and I'm willing to take the next step when the door appears. Let those words settle before you rush past them. You may feel something small inside you. Loosen when you say them. Maybe it is only a breath you did not realize you were holding, or the quiet recognition that you have been carrying a verdict that was never meant to become your identity. When the old prosecutor returns, and it may you do not have to spend all your strength arguing with him. You can simply remember what the deeper record says. There are deposits as well as losses. There is restoration as well as regret, and your story is still capable of moving forward. And I want you to notice that this brings us back to the question underneath everything we have been talking about. If the bridge between seeing and moving is where you keep getting stuck, if you can recognize the life you want and still find yourself hesitating at the moment that matters, then what actually helps that bridge come alive again? You have made promises to yourself before, chosen one, and you meant them when you made them. So this cannot simply be another speech about trying harder. There has to be something deeper than another vow made at 2 a.m. and forgotten when the morning becomes heavy. Because willpower has already had its turn, you have pushed yourself, started again, made schedules, set intentions, and told yourself that this time you would finally become the person who follows through. And when it fell apart again, you used the failure as evidence against yourself, when perhaps the deeper issue was that you were asking an exhausted part of you to carry a burden it had been carrying for years. The bridge does not reopen because you shame yourself into crossing it. It begins to reopen when you stop treating your hesitation as proof that you are broken and start understanding what has been happening underneath it. Think about those moments when the desire is still there, almost painfully clear, but something inside you seems to step backward just as you are about to move. You can picture the conversation, the project, the decision, the change, even the feeling of relief afterward, and yet the hand stays on the handle. Then another day passes, and you tell yourself you will try again tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes next week, next month, another season, until one day you realize you've been standing beside the same unopened door for years. That is why the answer cannot depend entirely on force. You have already discovered what happens when you make yourself the enemy. The more you criticize yourself, the more exhausted you become, and the more exhausted you become, the harder it feels to move. At some point, chosen one, healing the pattern has to mean learning a different relationship with your own mind, your own fear, your own attention, and that quiet part of you that still knows there is something unfinished. And perhaps this is the part you were not ready to understand earlier. You are not being asked to become someone completely different before you can move forward. So much of what you have been searching for may already exist inside you, buried beneath years of noise, disappointment, comparison, and the habit of postponing yourself. The work is less about becoming worthy of the next season and more about becoming present enough to recognize it when it arrives. If you have ever looked at a shelf, a drawer, a folder, or a room filled with things you once believed you would do, you know what I mean. Those abandoned pieces of your life can carry a strange emotional weight, because they remember a version of you who still believed there was plenty of time. Sometimes you avoid looking at them because you are afraid of what they will ask you to admit. But the fact that something still stirs in you when you remember them tells you there is still movement beneath the silence. So do not confuse this moment with another demand to fix your entire life overnight. The first movement may be much smaller than that. It may be opening the notebook again, sending the message, making the call, taking 15 quiet minutes with the thing you keep postponing, or simply admitting that the dream still matters to you. A bridge is crossed one step at a time, and sometimes the first step is simply becoming willing to stand there without turning away. This is why the next 72 hours matter as an experiment in awareness, not because you need to force a miracle into existence. Pay attention to what keeps returning to you. Notice the idea that comes back while you are driving the conversation. You suddenly realize you need to have the unfinished task that keeps appearing in your mind, the small impulse you would normally dismiss because it seems too ordinary to matter. You do not have to call every coincidence a prophecy. You simply have to become present enough to notice where your attention is naturally being drawn. And now we come back to waiting, because this is where the cost becomes real. 5 years ago, a month of hesitation may have felt like a month you could easily recover, especially when the next opportunity seemed far away. But something changes when you become aware of how much of your life has already been spent postponing what matters. Because time stops feeling abstract, a day begins to feel like a real piece of your life, something you can either inhabit consciously or hand over to the same pattern that has already taken so much from you. That does not mean heaven is punishing you for being late. It means you are becoming aware of density. There are seasons when life feels spacious, when one decision can wait another week, and another opportunity seems certain to come around. Then there are seasons when several things seem to converge at once, when old questions return, unfinished matters rise back to the surface, and the distance between one decision and its consequences becomes much smaller. Think of an airport during an ordinary week, compared with the same airport during a holiday rush. The runways have not changed. The gates are still there, and the rules remain the same. But everything is moving closer together. Missing one connection can affect the next several, because there is less empty space between what comes before and what comes after. That is the feeling I want you to recognize in your own life now. You may be standing in one of those denser seasons, chosen one where the invitation is becoming harder to ignore. The urgency you have felt may not be about danger at all. It may be about attention. Something in you has become aware that another year of repeating the same pattern will cost more than you once understood, and that is why this moment matters, because the next window does not require you to have your whole life figured out. It asks you to be awake enough to recognize when it opens. If you are completely honest with yourself right now, you already know what comes next, not your entire future, not some enormous plan you have to figure out tonight, but one specific thing that came to mind while you were listening. Maybe it is a conversation you have been avoiding, a first step you keep making excuses around, or something you once cared about that has been sitting quietly in the back of your life. Whatever it is, chosen one, notice how quickly your mind tried to explain it away, because that little moment of recognition may matter more than another hour spent thinking. And if what came to mind is simply the thing you have postponed for years, then begin there. You do not have to climb the whole mountain tonight. You only have to prove to yourself that you can move in its direction again. Give it 15 minutes, and let those 15 minutes be enough for now. Send the message, open the document, make the call, take the first walk, return to the page you abandoned, or sit quietly with the decision you have been avoiding. The size of the action is almost beside the point. What matters is that you stop describing the door and place your hand on it. For years you may have been waiting to feel certain enough, healed enough, motivated enough, or confident enough to begin. But sometimes clarity comes after movement, rather than before it. You do not need to feel like a completely different person. You need to let the person who is already waking up inside you take one honest step. Then pay attention to the next 72 hours, not with frantic expectation, but with a quieter kind of awareness. Something you thought was finished may return to your attention. A conversation may reopen. An old idea may suddenly feel different, or a possibility you had stopped considering may become visible again. Let those moments be what they are, without forcing them into a prophecy. Sometimes the first sign of change is simply that something you had emotionally buried becomes possible to look at again. And there may also be a moment when the old sentence returns. Something may happen that makes you feel behind again. Someone may appear to be living the life you wanted. A delay may touch an old wound, or you may wake up one morning and hear that familiar voice whisper, "See, nothing has changed." When that happens, remember what you learned tonight. An old thought returning does not mean you have returned to your old life. The pattern may resist being changed simply because it has been familiar for so long. You may even feel strangely uncomfortable when the inner noise becomes quieter, because anxiety can become so familiar that peace initially feels unfamiliar. If that happens, breeze and let the quiet remain quiet. You do not have to fill it with another problem just because your mind has forgotten what stillness feels like. And chosen one, if you stayed with this message through the parts that touch the places you usually avoid, pause for a moment and recognize that you stayed. You listened to the sentence you have been carrying. You looked at the patterns you have repeated, and you allowed yourself to consider that your past may deserve compassion as much as it deserves accountability. That does not erase the years you wish had been different, but it changes what those years are allowed to mean. Hold on to this sentence tonight. You are allowed to begin from where you actually are. Write it somewhere if you need to, not as another command you will later use against yourself, but as a reminder for the morning when the old fog tries to return. You have spent enough time believing that starting late means starting without power. Sometimes the person who begins after everything has changed carries a depth that the earlier version of themselves could not have understood. And now, if it feels right, place your hand over your heart and feel the rhythm beneath your palm. Think about how many nights you believed you had wasted, how many times you looked at the clock and calculated what should have happened by now, and how that same heart kept beating through every one of them. You are still here, still capable of choosing, still capable of taking one small step towards something that matters. Say this slowly with me. Father, I am here. I release the belief that my life is already over, or that my best days have passed me by. I bring what is unfinished into your presence, and I am willing to take the next faithful step. Restore what can be restored in me. Teach me how to move with wisdom, and help me recognize the doors that are truly mine to walk through. I choose to be awake for the life that is still unfolding. Amen. Stay with that feeling for a moment before you rush back into the noise of the world. Maybe the weight does not disappear all at once, and it does not need to. Perhaps something quieter has simply taken its place. When the 2 in the morning hour comes again, as it sometimes does when old habits are still learning a new rhythm, you may find yourself doing the same arithmetic, counting the years and measuring what you believe you lost. But this time, ask a different question. What can I still do with the life that is here? There is nothing left to gain by pretending the past did not happen. You missed things. You hesitated. You waited too long in places where you wish you had moved sooner, and you are allowed to grieve that honestly. But grief does not have to become a permanent address. Let it teach you what matters. Then bring your 15 minutes to the door, and if someone came to mind while you were listening, someone who speaks about their dream as though it belongs entirely to the past, reach out to them. You do not have to explain everything you heard or convince them of anything. You can simply tell them, you are not too late. Sometimes a person does not need another answer. They need one human being to remind them that their story has not become meaningless just because the timing looked different from what they imagined. The door may ask something very small from you. A conversation, a page, a walk, a decision, a return to something you abandoned. 15 quiet minutes with the part of your life you keep postponing. Do not underestimate small obedience simply because it looks ordinary from the outside. A life can change direction through an action so small that nobody else even notices it happened. And when you stand there, remember the image we have carried through this message. You spent years looking at the door and believing that lateness meant you had lost the right to approach it. Now you understand that the first thing you have to change is the sentence you carry as you walk toward it. Chosen one, you were late. That part of the story can be spoken honestly, but late is a description of where you have been, not a permanent name for who you are. So take your next 15 minutes. Bring your whole, imperfect, still healing self with you, and when the door opens, even if it opens quietly, be awake enough to recognize that you are standing there. Walk through while it is open.